Hi, how are you, Kristen?
Good. How are you?
Good. Can you hear me okay?
I can. I can hear you great.
Oh, I'm so glad. We are so excited.
Hello.
Ah. I'm Allison Frenzel. I'm one of the owners at Fabled and
Well,
absolutely thrilled to have you.
it's nice to meet you. Thank you. You guys were such big early supporters of
Oh,
the.
absolutely.
I wanted to do my best to say thank you.
You're
You,
so kind to do this. I know you've got to be just worn out
yes.
from traveling, and I'm sure you had some great stories to tell.
It was fun. Well, you've been looking pretty busy too. I've been seeing you sitting all over in nice dresses and such.
I'm wearing my red and gold.
I was
I
just going to say, Elizabeth always does such a great job of matching the book, which we love a theme here.
It's
yeah.
it's good to matchy.
True.
So I think I was telling Allison today, you were the first major author to ever follow me on Instagram.
I was.
I
I
still
love
remember where I was when I was like, oh my word, Kristin
that.
is following me. I've got to be on my best behavior.
Oh, you can do your worst.
Oh
That's
my
I'm
goodness. Well, we're just so excited. And I guess we'll start in about 5 minutes. We had a
yeah.
huge group who I'm not sure if Kai's on to tell us how many, but this morning over 222
I
people.
just looked. It's over. Oh, she said 236, but Kai, I just looked and I saw 256.
Yeah.
So we are climbing
Yeah.
too. Everyone heard about it. And this is recorded. So everyone receives an email tomorrow. So some people, even though they've registered, they'll watch it tomorrow. But I had so many friends when I posted about it, they're like, what? What? And I was like, I know, I know. I'm so excited. Anyways,
I
we'll
have
glad
to
she got you.
I have been doing this a long time. I have never seen a book about women by a woman, do something like this. It's amazing.
It's a
That is
special book,
wonderful.
that's for sure. Well, I reached out to you because my mother was a nurse in the Navy during the Vietnam era. And if it weren't for the Vietnam War, I would not be alive, which is a very
Oh,
strange.
wow.
My dad had a very low draft number, born in 1948, and he was going to be sent to Vietnam. And his father said, I was in the Navy. He was during World War II. This is a good thing for you to do. So he shipped off from Alabama to New England, and that's where he met my mother. So it's a weird feeling to think an event that caused so many deaths was the reason I was alive. So
That is
Well,
anyway,
wild.
yours was one of the first sort of personal stories that I started getting back, once the book was out, and that's been just an amazing and remarkable thing to sort of collect those and to just hear, that stories are now being told that have been, hidden for a long time.
Mhm.
It's very
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, I know. Well, I have been a fan of yours since the beginning. I'm a pre-Nightingale fan, which,
Yes, that's saying something too,
that's saying
right?
a lot. I remember a Christmas of mine being ruined because I was reading Firefly Lane and I was balled up in the corner crying because it was probably the saddest book I ever read. Just like the most touching story. But so I've always been a huge fan. And then when I saw what this subject matter was, I thought, oh my word, I really did have a weekend where my husband went out of town and I said, all I'm doing this weekend is reading the women. So that is my job. But I finished it in one day because I loved it so much. So
Wow, it is a big book, Elizabeth.
that's all I did all day long was read. I could not stop reading it. My eyes were hurting and I said, I've got to push through.
Push through. That is really funny.
Oh man. So how's the weather in Seattle right now? Are you,
It's actually really pretty right now. I don't know if you can see, but there's like sunlight coming into my office, which is
Nice.
always a good thing and never to be taken for granted here.
yeah,
Seriously.
I'm going to be in Seattle in July. So I'm excited to be back. I went for Winter Institute last year. My cousin lives in Seattle, and I get to visit some of my favorite bookstores there. Like I love Island Books. The owner of Island Books is just such a doll. and of course Elliott Bay. So I'll be there soon. I can't wait.
That's
Well,
a
we
good
should
time
have-
to go to Seattle.
Yeah, we should have good weather for you there. That's for sure. I hope. Fingers crossed.
Well, it'll be better than home. I have a
Yes.
feeling at the end of
Yes.
July.
Well,
So
we always want a mass exodus about July, August here because
Yeah,
it's just
too hot.
It's too hot.
too
Absolutely.
hot. Yeah. Well, all we've had is rain for the last couple of weeks. This is our first sunny day in a very long time.
Yes.
So we
it's
don't do
true.
anything halfway.
I know Texas can't. It always has to be extra in every way.
Okay, and I have another fun story about you, Kristin. I think so. Right when we opened, about then is when the Dust Bowl book came out.
Four winds. Yeah.
Thank you. I just had a moment, and I was invited to a Zoom event with you where you were going to talk about the book. I think it was a bunch of Texas booksellers.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, I'm sure it's going to be, I just assumed it was going to be this, like a lot of people listening in on you talking. And we had an event that night. And I was like, well, I really want to hear you talk. So I'm going to go ahead to stop and listen to your Zoom. And I click on and you went, hello, Elizabeth. There was not that, there was like 12 of us. And I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe how
That's
personal that was.
so
That meant a
cool.
lot to me and to other booksellers too, that you did that. So
That was, the very beginning of the pandemic. And, I usually like to try to go to some bookstores and, kind of get out there and meet people. And we couldn't. And so you talked to Dory and said, is there any way to have like a cocktail party through this thing? Because Zoom was sort of brand new then. And it was so just wonderful to connect after so much time, locked in and everything. It was really great.
I loved it. Of course, I loved the book. We picked it. Every one of your books we picked. I've been in the same personal book club for over 20 years, and every time there's a new, we just had our book club last month, and it was the women. But I loved the Four Winds, and The Worst Hard Time was one of my favorite nonfictions, and it just was so great to read a fictionalized tale of it too.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. So what is the format tonight? Like,
Well, I'll go ahead and start and then I'll kind of give you the rundown so everybody can know what it is. So but first of all, we have a good amount of participants already here, and welcome to the Fabled Book Club. If you are new to us, this is a webinar where we'll be speaking with the author, myself, and Elizabeth Barnhill, our book buyer. We are here today with Kristin Hannah, who I'm assuming you've heard of. If not, we're going to have Elizabeth read a little bit of her bio so that you know. But we have a chat available. You can ask questions in the chat and we'll try to get to them. Most likely we have our own questions for Kristin, and we will probably ask something that you've already thought of, but we don't always. So feel free to put them in the chat as soon as you think of them, and we'll try our best to get to them. And afterwards, we will introduce our next month's book and give you all of the signups for that, so you can join us the next month. But I will turn it over to Elizabeth to formally introduce our guest tonight.
All right. Well, I am just utterly thrilled to introduce Kristin Hannah to our group. And of course, she needs no introduction, but I'm going to attempt one anyway. Kristin Hannah is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of more than 20 novels, including The Nightingale, The Great Alone, and The Four Winds. A former lawyer and turned writer, she lives with her husband in the Pacific Northwest. So before we started this, I told Kristin, I mean, I have been a fan of hers since the very beginning and read all of her books. I put The Winter Garden in so many hands. I did it this week. And so when I could hardly wait for your next book. And when I found out it was about service women in nurses during the Vietnam War, my jaw just nearly dropped. I couldn't believe, because I love reading about the Vietnam War time frame. And again, my mother was a naval nurse during the Vietnam War. So it was a very personal story to me. And I loved being able to read the story and really kind of think, this is maybe what my mom was thinking or feeling. So I just appreciate you so much for joining us. I know you've had a very rigorous tour, and you were so kind to meet with us tonight. So thank you so much, Kristin, for joining us. And and again, there's spoilers abound. This is book club. So
Yes,
if people have
thank you
not
for-
read it, it's there
Oh,
on
this
the
is,
site.
oh boy,
Yeah.
okay.
Yes.
So we kind of have a fun book club that way.
I
Yes.
better get ready, okay.
We get to get
Um,
down to the nitty gritty and the whys and all those things. So
Okay.
yes, if you're new to our book club, we will be spoiling the ending here. So if you need to click off and get the recording later and watch it, and this will be recorded and you'll receive it 24 hours later after we complete this.
All right, so Kristin, just in case it's been a while since people have read the book, can you give a little brief synopsis of what you call the book of your heart?
Well, as you said, this is a book set during the Vietnam War. It is about a young, idealistic young woman, a nurse, just graduated, who decides to ship off and volunteer for the Vietnam War. And it's what she experiences during the war, and then what she experiences when she comes home. And I was just talking to someone today, in fact, about this sort of arc where you think with this kind of a story that the war is going to be the hardest part of Frankie's journey. But what is the most difficult part is coming home and dealing with what she saw, what she experienced, and how Americans treated her when she came home.
To write about an event which is both controversial and many people living experienced it, what was your approach to researching?
You know, both of those things weighed heavily on me, you know, and in fact, to go back a little, and if you guys have all read the book, you know this from my author's note, I have wanted to write this book for well over 20 years. And it's because I was a child during the war, and my best friend's father was shot down. And so we wore those POW bracelets, the little silver ones that are in the book. And the idea of that was that we would wear these bracelets in memory of the serviceman until he came home. And so he never came home. So I wore this bracelet and I wore this bracelet. And so when Vietnam sort of faded from the conversation, it was still kind of a part of my life because I was looking at this man's name every day. And then I saw how the vets were treated when they came home. And even a child went, you know, something is wrong here. And it just was something that, you know, stayed with me. And so I have wanted to write it forever. I first pitched it to my editor in 1997. And I had a fabulous editor who is of the Vietnam era age. And, you know, she said, Kristin, you're not ready. And even more importantly, the country's not ready. Nobody wants to talk about this war. And so I put it aside. So I was always aware from the very beginning of the burden of trying to tell this story, which I thought was so important. And, you know, like I know, you know, Elizabeth, having written about veterans before in like Homefront and The Great Alone and some other books, I'm really personally invested in how we treat them and how we talk about them and how we support them. And so I was really nervous. And here I was writing a historical novel where people who had actually experienced this would be reading it. And so the level of, you know, the risk level seemed incredibly high. But like with the Nightingale, once I came upon this story of the nurses who had served, I was so angry that we didn't know this story. And I was so invested in these women. And I realized that they were, you know, they're aging, they're 70, they're 80, some of them are older. And I was like, this story needs to be told, and it needs to be told now. So I am just going to dive in and hope that the slant that I give, which is focused on the veterans themselves, would, I guess, diminish some of the political sort of animus that is out there right now in terms of the fear of saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing.
What has been the response of women who served? How how has the book been received? And, you know, have you met many of these women on your tours? Any interesting stories you'd love to share with us?
Gosh, there's been so many. I mean, it's hard to even describe the impact that this has had on the vets, male and female, and on their children. Just a few small asides. Well, first of all, I met a woman named Diane Carlson Evans, who wrote a book called Healing Wounds, which was her memoir about her time nursing in Vietnam. And it was a really powerful, wonderful book. And she came home and founded the Women's Vietnam War Memorial. And so I sort of stalked her until she would agree to read my book, which she did, and sort of helped me with it. And then she invited me to Veterans Day this year in Washington, D.C. at the Women's Memorial. And it turns out that it was the 30th anniversary. And so I met this amazing, I mean, I just can't even tell you how inspiring these women were and are. And to see them at their own memorial and hugging and talking to each other and sharing their war experiences. And that was sort of the beginning of me thinking something about how this book could be perceived, because there was one woman who came up during the event, and she was one of the very, very few who had read the book. And she looked at me and she started crying, and she said, "This book is going to start to heal us." And I've just seen that and heard that so repeatedly. And it just reminds me how much healing there is still to be done.
It gave me chills.
Yes, me
I
too.
know, me too.
Has there been any pushback on your interpretation of the Vietnam War?
I mean, there's always people who don't like the book. There's always reasons that they don't like the book. There's always choices that I made that they wouldn't have made, or I'm not a good enough writer, or Frankie's unlikable. There's all of those kinds of, I'm used to all that. That's normal. What is surprising is everybody seems to be pro, it's time this story was told, and pro vet. Even if you sort of disagree with it, it's pretty hard to look at the way we treated these vets and not feel some level of responsibility, I think, as an American.
When I think about the story, it feels to me like it's not just a war story. It's a love, but to me, it's a love story, and it's a love story between three friends. I loved the relationship. It's probably my favorite part of the book, with Frankie, Barb, and Ethel. And I just think that you write women's friendships so well, Kristin. And I wondered if that's, what that means to you, writing these female friendships. And I'm thinking of Firefly Lane and different stories that you tell, but that to me was my favorite part of the book. And I also want to say, people tell me how they feel about books, and I hear it all. I haven't heard a single negative thing about this book. Everyone I know has loved it. So
wow,
wanted to say
amazing.
that, but yes, but let's talk about the friendship between these three fantastic women.
Well, I mean, that really is the beating heart of this book. And it's funny because sort of from a creative standpoint, I never saw that coming. That was not my plan. My plan was I was going to write Frankie's story, and I'm writing along, and I'm doing all the research, and she gets to Vietnam on her first day, and she's thrown into this little tiny hooch with two other women who she would never have been friends with, otherwise. And I realized, oh my gosh, these women are trapped in this room for a year, under the most extreme, most difficult circumstances. And I thought about all the men's war camaraderie stories that we're used to seeing. And I thought, okay, I mean, instantly, these women are going to become more than friends. I did not know that they would become essentially soulmates, you know, that they would each drop everything for the other for the whole of their lives and be there. And I really love that part of it as well, because especially as I get older, I think that our friendships sustain us. You know, I mean, you need them. So when something goes right in your life, you need your girlfriends. When something goes wrong, you need your girlfriends. And I'm always like out there saying to people, don't forget, you know, we all spend so much fiction and sort of lifetime talking about falling in love, getting married, having children, having a career, all of those big milestones. And we need to always be saying, you know, find your tribe and maintain those friendships, because you will need them.
So
Amen.
true. Absolutely. I do want to mention that there are some beautiful comments in the chat and some sent directly to us, that Kristin, I hope you get the chance to read when you receive this tomorrow. If you don't get a chance now, they're just so wonderful, just about this book and what it means to people, and women in challenging jobs. And I would love to talk about kind of those unique challenges for women in combat zone, like Frankie showing up with her dress and her tights, you know, the first day, Vietnam, being
Yeah.
being like worried for her safety, a bunch of men being around. I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that concerned me, of course, as writing this, was I knew that if I was going to tackle this subject of women in a MASH unit in Vietnam, I would have to be relentless and visceral and ugly and difficult. You know, that you can't show war and like turn away or pretend it was something else. And the reason that was so important to me, to really show what it was like for them, was because I remember writing Homefront 15 years ago, about a female Black Hawk pilot. And I was talking to her, and, you know, we were talking about PTSD and women and all this kind of stuff. And she said, but, you know, we aren't in combat. And I was like, you're flying a Black Hawk pilot or a helicopter, and you're being shot at, and you're dropping down on the land, but that's not combat. No, because, you know, we weren't holding a gun. It wasn't combat. And so when I came across that again in Vietnam, where when they came home, the women were told, how can you have, you know, emotional trauma? You weren't in combat. It was so important for me to say, look, let's have a conversation about what trauma is and what causes it. And you can be a nurse in combat, you can be a police officer, you can be a firefighter. I mean, all of these kinds of really challenging jobs that are primarily male dominated have these effects on women. And so it was just really important for this book to say, this is combat, in my opinion, and they need to be treated as if they saw and experienced what they actually did.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, I've been thinking a lot about protests. Of course, that's really in the news right now. Interestingly, I just had a son who graduated from college last week, and he was one of the COVID kids who did not get the graduation, was all messed up in 2020. And then so many college graduations 4 years later were stopped or halted or altered because of war protests. So it's very timely that it was also in the book. So in the beginning, Frankie's seeing these protests going on, and then she eventually becomes part of the protests. And what do you think that they help? Do you think that they make a difference in the war efforts?
You know, I can tell you that it was my feeling, based on my research on the Vietnam War. And this circles back to what you were asking, Allison, about the choices that I made and the controversial nature of the potential that this book had. And I wanted to say, hey, we have to respect these vets. We have to look at what happened to them. We have to look at how we treated them. But we also have to understand that the protesters, that was a patriotic act as well, and that did, in my opinion, hasten the end of the war. And so I think, one of the things the book has to say is patriotism comes in a lot of shapes and colors and sizes. And I think the importance is sort of clarity, in terms of what your protest is trying to accomplish.
I would love to talk about Frankie and her story, just her incredible arc. Did her story look the same when the novel was published versus when you turned in your draft?
No. I am a notoriously heavy editorial hand, notoriously heavy. And that is my favorite part of the process, the editorial. And so what happens is I spend a year researching and coming up with what the story is going to be. And then I sit down and I write as close to that as I sort of can. And what happens as I continue writing and as it evolves, I see what's working really well and what's working less well. And so what I then try to do is not, like, some writers will sort of rework and edit and shoehorn to make sure that their original vision is what the book is. I will throw away everything except for what I think is working. The original version of this book, the Vietnam War was always the Vietnam War. In the first version, there was almost nothing about, or not nearly as much with Barb and Ethel in the second half. They were, wartime friends. And the entire second half was the love story with Frankie and the man that she married in Vietnam. So there you go.
Interesting. Well, something that I really thought about quite a bit with this book, I was in high school when Desert Storm was going on, the original, and I think that was Desert Storm in 1991. And I remember very clearly when the troops came home, there was such an importance put on, we've got to be supportive because of what happened in Vietnam, which wasn't that long ago at that point. And so I'm thinking about, what do we owe the men and women in our service organizations? And I'll say, during COVID, I am a speech pathologist. I was working in a hospital setting, taking care of active COVID patients, head to toe PPE, doing that. Then I have something at Fabled, and I take it all off and run to Fabled and do something, and then come back and put it on, and got tested 3 times a day, 3 times a week, and it was so traumatic. And I think about that, and I'm not. There were people who had way harder jobs than I did, even during that time. What do we, as a society, owe these people? Owe the nurses and the police officers and the military, to say thank you for what you do for us?
I mean, it's such a huge topic, and from my author's note that the nurses during the pandemic were really the last piece of me putting this puzzle together and finally writing this book, because watching that and seeing that sacrifice for us, and seeing at the time, at least from an outsider, I don't profess to have perfect knowledge, but I remember thinking, we sure aren't acting as grateful as we need to be acting, given what we're asking of these people and given what they are providing for us. And so, I mean, obviously the easiest baseline level is gratitude and respect and the supplies and the support that they need to get their job done and to get their job done well. But then, beyond that, bigger issues, from a more political kind of landscape, is we need to take care of them when they come home, however that is defined. We need to find somehow to say to people, saying that you're suffering from PTSD from any one of these things is not a weakness in you, is not an issue that you need to deal with. You know, you need to be able to say, this is the very human cost of this job, and I need help, and we need to be there for people.
So true. Your books do such a great job at shining a light on invisible women, which thank you for that. Why does amplifying silent voices mean so much to you?
You know, that's interesting. That is a realization and a passion that came at a certain age. You know, I was, let me think, I think I was 29 or 30 when I began writing. And, you know, for years I wrote about the women who were like me, who were in my circle, things like Firefly Lane, writing, you know, my story with my mom, stories about best friends, stories about the push and pull between stay-at-home moms and working moms, and, you know, and women's roles and desires and expectations, all of that. And it wasn't until really I hit about 50, and my son, of course, was, you know, gone, and my husband and I were as empty nesters. And that's when I started for the first time really thinking about women in general, and our history, and why it was that with, you know, 7 years of college, I knew so little about what women were doing at any given point. You know, pick one on the map, and you know what the men are doing, you don't know what the women are doing. And I think the first book where I sort of put my toe in the water of that was Winter Garden, like you point out, Elizabeth, and, you know, the women of World War II Russia and Leningrad, and the remarkable I guess achievement of their survival, you know, alone. And so I just have, you know, spent 10 or 15 years really plunging in and realizing and sharing with other readers and writers and just, you know, people in general, that there are a lot of amazing, resilient, remarkable women out there who have made a difference in history. Maybe it's a small way, maybe it's keeping their children alive during impossible you know, circumstances. And to say that that is every bit as brave as, you know, as trying to take a hill, as trying to, you know, do those sorts of things. And it's really great to see that at this moment in time, we are living in this world where I think for the first time, marginal voices are being sought out, and forgotten stories are being remembered and told and passed along. And I think what it does is it just allows the kids coming up behind us, the women, the girls especially, to know that there's nothing they can't do, and not in some esoteric way, but in, you know, a grounded real world history kind of way.
So
I think
true.
that's our job so rewarding at the bookshop, is helping to amplify those voices. So okay, another part of the book that I loved is just the 60s nostalgia.
Yeah.
You know, my parents were 60s kids, and so all of the music and all this felt like my childhood, felt like I was in the back seat of a station wagon. So can you talk about the research and just delving into the 1960s and the music? I hear there's a Spotify playlist somewhere.
I hear that too. I don't know what that means or how to get to it, but that's on my to-do list. You know, that was just fun. I mean, I grew up in Southern California in the early 60s. And so to do Coronado Island, California, to do the music, the sort of the beginning of the surf culture, and I loved all of that. And the music of the war era is very much sort of research driven. I mean, a lot of those, they're the angry kind of protest songs. Those weren't, prevalent in my childhood. But when we get to the other side of the war, where it's John Denver and Helen Reddy and Jim Croce, and, I just had so much fun choosing my mom's favorite songs, the songs that, from my station wagon years. And I think it immediately, when you see a song like that, it just immediately plunges you back into that moment. And it makes it a lot of fun for the reader and the writer.
Well, what about even the medical emergencies? How did you write those in an intelligent way?
Like I said, I had some great help. I mean, I had to write it all. So I had to somehow take all this fact, take all this information, glean from people's memoirs, and then sort of metabolize it and turn it into action. And sometimes, that works really well. And sometimes it doesn't. I had one of my readers who was a doctor in this era looked at one of the scenes and he said, I don't care how great you think Frankie is, she would never be allowed to do this. And she couldn't do this. And I'm like, okay, well, what could she do? And so we kind of have to then battle it out where, he's the medical guy who wants to say, well, that's really crossing a line. And I'm like, well, what if I kind of want that, and then we figure out what we can do.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, I will say I've had an awful lot of nurses tell me that it feels real. So that's pretty relieving.
Looks like Courtney put the link for the Spotify playlist in the
Oh,
chat.
Courtney, is she the police officer?
She is. Yes, she is. So great. I would love to, when I was reading this and closing, and my parents are of this era, I wondered if you wonder or think about where Frankie would be now in present day. Has she found peace, love?
Yes.
Any thoughts about her? Yes.
I
Yes,
mean,
both.
I think we ended with Frankie at exactly the moment I wanted Frankie to be at, where she is at peace with herself. She's at peace with her experience. She has created this family of like-minded people who she loves. She's found a way to use her pain and her recovery to help other women and, sort of offer a hand up to them. I think she needed animals and acreage and water and mountains and all of that to sort of find the quiet that she needed. And so I think, she's happy. She's living in the country and living her best life, I hope.
I love it. I think of her as a little bit of a pioneer woman in the fact that she did something that so many women didn't. So it just makes sense for her to be in that setting.
I thought so. I'm a big believer in animals as healers and caring for animals as healing, as a part of the healing process. So I guess I kind of threw a little of that in.
I love it.
The other day I was at the grocery store and a guy was walking with a service dog, and the service dog probably came up to my shoulders. I've never seen such a large dog in my life in the grocery store aisle. That was, and I thought, I'm sure that dog means a lot to that man.
Yes.
So I don't ever do this, but I'm going to give you, I've got 3 questions and you get to choose which one you want. Choose your own adventure, Kristin. Okay. So what are you working on next? I'm sure you get asked that a lot. That's the number 1. Where do you find these stories of these invisible women? Or what are your favorite books / authors?
Gosh, those are all good questions. Okay.
I just wanted to give you a choice.
I'm going to go with door number 2.
Okay.
Where do I find these stories? It almost feels to some extent like they find me. because, I have kind of an interest maybe in something. Okay, so like the first one I found was World War II Leningrad. The reason I found World War II Leningrad is because I'm a huge Romanov buff. I'm one of those people who just loves, the Romanov Empire and period and all of that, and by extension, that period in Russia. And so I'm reading for Winter Garden, and I stumble across the story of Andre Dujon, who was the young Belgian woman who started the first escape route, or one of the first escape routes out of Nazi occupied France. And I'm just horrified that, as well read as I am and as much historical fiction as I read, I have no idea that young women were saving men and putting their lives at risk and going to concentration camps and all of this to save strangers in what, has to be the most frightening sort of landscape in the world, Nazi occupied France. So, and while I'm, sort of reading that, I'm writing The Nightingale, and somehow I come across the photographs of Dorothea Lange, which of course I had seen, we've all seen them. Mm-hmm. But suddenly I was at that point and at that age when I went, wait a second, I don't know anything about this. We've all been taught the Great Depression. I know about the stock market crash. And then we go to World War II. And that's all I know. And so I do think that that the fact is that you can't pick a historical period, I don't think, anywhere in the world where there aren't lost women's stories. And it doesn't take a whole lot of research if you find an area or a time period that interests you, to say, here's something really, really interesting and worth delving into.
Yeah. That Dorothea Lange picture haunts me. I think the woman was 28 years old or something like that.
And she looks like 60. I mean, it's just, and I did a lot, of course, of, research for the Four Winds, because I knew nothing about any of that. And her pictures are just a remarkable record. There are others. There's a Arthur Rubinstein, I think is his name. And his were amazing. But the picture of, there's that famous picture of Dorothea Lange standing on the top of the car with her camera pointed out. And, you think to yourself, okay, that is some woman. Where's the movie about her?
True.
I like that. Some woman.
And is there any woman right now that you're thinking about, or is this is a time where you're just focusing on the women?
I'm just, I would like, I have a kind of a glimmer of an idea, but I'm not yet clear enough on it to say that it's going to stay. So I think I'll keep that one for the conversation we have next year.
Yes.
I love it. Very
We have a few good questions in the chat. One, Danielle, she wants to talk about rye, which I'm all for. I feel like once you put aviators on him, I was like, this man is good looking in my mind. I know exactly what he looks like. She said, there's never been a character that has had me on such an emotional roller coaster.
Well, gosh, it's so hard for me to get past my reluctance for spoilers. I will tell you, when I spoke earlier about the idea that this book was a love story and she had married in Vietnam, it was rye. So the whole first iteration of this book, rye was her true love.
Wow. The whole scene at the airport reminded me so much of the scene in Castaway too, like where there's two people that were supposed to be together and they're not, and your heart is broken for them. It was so great. We have one more question. Okay.
Oh, I don't normally, anyone who reads me a lot knows I don't mess with the viewer or the reader much. I'm a pretty straightforward gal. And so I think the whole rye storyline really comes out of the blue for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's true. One other question is anything surprise you when writing this book?
The thing that surprised me the most was, as I was doing the research, I kept reading in the memoirs over and over again, these women were told by the VA, by the marchers, by everybody, there were no women in Vietnam. And I remember thinking to myself, well, that's ridiculous. And how can that possibly be true? I mean, we're watching MASH. We know that there have been nurses on battlefields, forever. But it's women's service is. It just isn't something that crosses into sort of the ordinary business. And so men and services like the VA, who absolutely should have known that there were women there. There were 10,000 women there. The fact that they didn't shocked me.
I feel the same way.
Yeah, the thing that frustrated me so much in the story was that the men came home and were shocked that they were not treated well. And then they turned around and did it to the women and said, like this pecking order of disrespect or something. So
yeah, and I heard something. I was speaking to one of the nurses, I think in DC, and she said something like, when she first was told there were no women in Vietnam, she said, well, if you never saw a woman, you were lucky, because it meant you were never in a hospital. And so there were, I'm sure, thousands of men who never did see a woman. And so I guess they could, arguably think there weren't any. But again, doesn't everyone know this?
yeah,
Crazy.
now they do, thanks to the women.
Yes, they do. That's so true.
I know.
Well, Kristin, this has been so wonderful, and we're going to announce our next book in a minute, but I do want to personally say thank you for this book and just the voices that you're giving to other women and giving to us, giving to people who've gone through PTSD, through experiences, or have been overlooked in their role. It's a beautiful piece of work. Seriously.
Well, thank you so much. And again, thank you so much. The bookstore has been amazing, so supportive from the very, very beginning. And I know I speak on behalf of all writers when I say thank you so much. I mean, especially early reads back. You work on a book for 3 years and then it goes out into the world and you have no idea if it's going to be well received. And so to start hearing, like the note I got from Elizabeth really early on, it just, it was really great and I appreciate it.
Well, Kristin, I mean, I'm sure you hear this all the time, but your writing is a gift, and it's special. There's something about it that's just different. It hits different. It is, I mean, I read a lot of books and nothing compares to a Kristin Hannah book to me. And I truly mean that. So thank you. And I'm so honored that you've had such a busy schedule and you took the time to speak to us tonight. It really means a lot.
Well, thank you. And thanks to all of the participants. I wasn't able to see, but a couple of the comments come through, but I will look for them tomorrow. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks. And if you guys stay tuned, we're going to announce our next book. I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth.
Yes, so the book for June is Real Americans by Rachel Khong. And this is one of my favorite books of the year. It was utterly fantastic. Kind of a very interesting construct. There's a multi-generational family. There's a mystery at the center of it. A lot of it takes place around New Year's Eve, 1999, which is always kind of a fun time. So I highly recommend the book and can't wait to speak to Rachel next month.
Yes, I can't wait to read this one. You've just said so much about it that I'm like ready, and I hope you guys are too.
Yeah, it's June something.
Yes. Let me look. June 18th. June 18th, we will be there. And there is the link to sign up for the Zoom and for purchasing the book through Fabled, which we appreciate everyone doing that can. But thank you guys so much for joining us, and we will see you guys next month.
Bye.
Bye.